The fluorescent lights of the non-profit office flickered softly, casting long shadows across the polished floors. I sat at my desk, fingers lightly tapping the keyboard, eyes scanning the endless stream of emails from board members who had once dismissed me as soft-hearted Mara, a volunteer too gentle to matter in the high-stakes world of fundraising and program management. They were busy, arranging meetings, celebrating donations, congratulating themselves on operational decisions, oblivious to the quiet scrutiny that had been silently tracking their every move for months. I smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, as I reviewed the latest budget reports. The numbers told a story they never suspected I was reading: misallocated funds, inflated expenses, minor embezzlement hidden in vague line items. They had assumed my quiet diligence was nothing more than naive loyalty. They had assumed I lacked authority or influence. But they didn't know, didn't even imagine, that I managed the very foundation that funded the majority of their operations, that my oversight controlled the lifeblood of the nonprofit itself. Years ago, I had joined the organization with a simple goal: make a difference. I had been passionate, eager, idealistic, and yes, soft-hearted. They had laughed at my gentle nature, my focus on ethics, my insistence on transparency. "Mara, just let it go," one director had said during a meeting about a questionable vendor contract. "We can't always get perfect compliance in the field." I had smiled, nodded, and let them speak, storing their arrogance and carelessness like seeds in fertile soil, waiting for the right season. That season had arrived. I had spent countless hours quietly auditing reports, tracking the flow of funds, understanding the hierarchy of influence, and quietly asserting my control over grants, donations, and the allocation of the foundation's resources. While they flaunted their influence and dismissed me as a background figure, I had become the invisible hand guiding, and now correcting, the entire operation. By noon today, they would begin to see that the soft-hearted volunteer they underestimated had far more power than they imagined. Part 1: The Setup. It had started innocently. I had joined the nonprofit fresh out of college, full of ideals and a drive to help communities. Mara, the quiet, diligent, empathetic one, was a volunteer who loved her work, listened to every story, and never argued in meetings. I had been invisible in boardroom politics, overlooked by those more vocal and self-assured. The directors, the executives, and even senior volunteers dismissed my presence, my opinions, my ideas. I had been told subtly and overtly that my soft-hearted approach would never make a difference in real fundraising. But I learned quickly: invisibility is a weapon when wielded with patience and foresight. I observed, catalogued, and absorbed every detail: the patterns of spending, the subtle mismanagement of funds, the board members' personal interests that occasionally bled into organizational priorities. I filed my observations silently, cross-checked figures, and began quietly gaining access to the foundation's internal systems. While they assumed their decisions went unchecked, I was reviewing, auditing, and preparing the ultimate leverage. Over the years, my role expanded without fanfare. I volunteered extra hours, managed donor relationships meticulously, and quietly became indispensable to the success of their initiatives. They trusted me, not realizing that trust carried power. I controlled the budgets they relied upon. I had the records of every transaction, every allocation, every misuse of funds. And I had the patience to wait for the perfect moment to assert it. The irony was delicious. Mara, the soft-hearted, gentle, quiet volunteer, was in fact the linchpin of the entire operation. The very people who had dismissed me were now dependent on my diligence, my oversight, and my silent authority. They had no idea that the very foundation they relied on was under my meticulous watch. This morning, as I sipped my coffee, I checked the latest expense reports once more. Misallocated donations, inflated invoices, and unreported funds glared at me from the spreadsheets. I made brief notes, quietly flagging each irregularity. They thought I was unaware that my soft-hearted nature meant blind loyalty. They were wrong. I had been preparing for this day for months, building a quiet, undeniable authority, and by the end of the week, they would understand just how much power the soft-hearted Mara truly held. I allowed myself a small smile. The emails would come first: questions, clarifications, subtle panic. Then the board meeting, where my careful review would reveal the depth of their negligence and the authority I wielded over their operations. And finally, the full realization: the soft-hearted volunteer they ignored controlled the very lifeblood of the organization they assumed they managed. They had underestimated me, as they always did. But patience, observation, and quiet action had transformed what they saw as weakness into unassailable power. Mara, the soft-hearted, gentle, overlooked volunteer, was about to become the undeniable authority. And no one would see it coming until it was too late. The morning sun spilled across the non-profit office, illuminating the neat stacks of files and softly humming computers. I moved between desks deliberately, a calm presence amid the subtle anxiety that had begun to ripple through the staff and board members. There was a tension in the air, barely perceptible but undeniable. People who had previously dismissed me, ignored my emails, and brushed off my observations were starting to sense that something had changed. I stopped at the first open office doorway, glancing over a report. A board member, Carla, froze mid-sentence as she typed an email. Her fingers hovered over the keys, uncertainty etched across her face. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I noticed. She had assumed my quiet nature equaled passivity. They all had. But patience, observation, and careful preparation had quietly positioned me as the fulcrum of influence they had always overlooked. By mid-morning, the first whispers began. Board members exchanged cautious glances, conversations punctuated with tentative questions and hesitation. One of them approached the finance assistant, asking if certain expense reports had been reviewed. The assistant, someone who had often deferred to my diligence without fanfare, paused, glanced at me briefly, and confirmed that I had already audited the numbers in detail. That moment, quiet as it was, sent a subtle shockwave through the room. They were realizing slowly, uncomfortably, that I had been silently controlling the oversight they thought they wielded. I leaned back in my chair, letting my calm, measured presence do the work I had trained it to do. Mara, the soft-hearted, gentle, unassuming volunteer, was quietly asserting control without confrontation. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't call anyone out yet. I simply existed as the silent authority, the invisible hand guiding the non-profit's finances with precision and inevitability. Every subtle nod, every carefully phrased observation, reinforced that the foundation's lifeblood flowed through my oversight. By late morning, the board's subtle panic began to take shape. Emails flooded my inbox, each one tinged with caution, a mix of curiosity and anxiety. "Mara, could you clarify the recent expenditure allocations?" asked one message. Another read, "We need confirmation on the funding reports before proceeding with the next project." I responded calmly, thoroughly, but with an undercurrent of quiet authority that could not be ignored. Each answer reinforced the fact that the soft-hearted volunteer they had dismissed now wielded control over their operational reality. It was mesmerizing to watch. The ones who had assumed leadership, who had strutted through meetings with self-assured arrogance, now deferred subtly, often unconsciously, to my judgment. I observed the micro-expressions, tight lips, brief glances, paused gestures. Authority does not always announce itself in loud, dramatic proclamations. Sometimes it seeps into every interaction, every email, every decision, quiet, undeniable, and ultimately unassailable. Around noon, I received an email from the finance director, someone who had previously prided themselves on independent control. The tone was careful, almost nervous. "Mara, I've reviewed the flagged reports. Could we meet to discuss the allocations before the board session?" I smiled faintly. "Yes," I replied succinctly, knowing full well that the meeting would subtly shift the power dynamic further in my favor. Every interaction, every confirmation, every subtle acknowledgement of my oversight was a reminder that the board had underestimated me for years. The board meeting later that afternoon was a study in quiet recalibration. They entered the room, confident as always, or so they thought, ready to discuss programs, outreach, and budgets. But the moment the discussion turned to the flagged expenditures, the subtle shift became visible. Carla, who had mocked my soft-hearted volunteerism in previous sessions, paused mid-sentence as I presented the findings. I did not raise my voice. I did not chastise anyone. I simply outlined the facts, systematically, calmly, with a quiet authority that left no room for dispute. Eyes widened. Postures stiffened. Subtle murmurs filled the room. It was the realization of the inevitable. The quiet Mara, the one they had ignored, now controlled the very foundation they relied upon for their operations. The air shifted, cautious, tense, filled with recognition that authority had arrived not with spectacle, but with precision, patience, and inevitability. By late afternoon, the ripple effect was undeniable. Board members, once loud and self-assured, now sought my approval, my confirmation, and my guidance on decisions that had previously been theirs alone. Even the finance assistant, who had quietly deferred to me for months, became a subtle conduit of influence, directing inquiries and requests through me first. The invisible web of authority I had woven over months was now fully operational, and the board was navigating it instinctively, unconsciously acknowledging the quiet shift in power. I paused in my office doorway, observing the subtle tension, the tentative deference, and the cautious conversations. It was almost poetic, how the ones who had laughed at me, dismissed me, and ignored me were now constrained by the authority I exercised so quietly. I did not gloat. I did not need to. The satisfaction was in the inevitability, in the quiet, meticulous orchestration of influence that left no room for argument, no space for resistance, no doubt about who truly controlled the organization's resources. By evening, I reviewed the day's emails, the flagged budgets, and the board responses. Each message was a reminder of how thoroughly the quiet control had taken hold. They were beginning to realize that their reliance on the foundation's funding was no longer just operational, it was behavioral. Every request, every clarification, every decision now flowed through me. The soft-hearted volunteer they had ignored had become the linchpin of authority, and they would navigate their actions accordingly. As I left the office, the cool evening air brushing against my face, I allowed a small private smile. Mara, the quiet, overlooked, underestimated volunteer, had transformed patience, observation, and meticulous oversight into undeniable influence. The board would never see the next moves coming, and by the time they did, it would already be too late. The foundation's power, and the responsibility to wield it wisely, rested firmly in my hands. I whispered softly to myself, almost as if confessing to no one, they ignored me, dismissed me, thought I was too gentle to matter. And now, every decision, every dollar, every choice, bends quietly, inevitably, around me. The office was quiet, deceptively ordinary, but I could feel the subtle undercurrent of tension that had begun to ripple through the nonprofit staff and board members. Every glance, every hesitation, every carefully measured step was a reflection of the new awareness slowly settling in their minds. Mara, the quiet, gentle volunteer, was no longer someone to dismiss. I had become the invisible hand guiding decisions, controlling resources, and quietly setting boundaries for a group that had long taken my soft-hearted nature for granted. By mid-morning, the first signs of panic were subtle but unmistakable. Carla, who had once openly mocked my meticulous attention to detail, hesitated before entering the board meeting room. Her eyes flicked toward me, darting nervously over my notes, and her hand shook slightly as she adjusted her papers. Even without a word, she understood. The soft-hearted volunteer she had overlooked now held the authority she had assumed she controlled. I allowed a small, private smile. Power does not always announce itself with shouting or spectacle. Sometimes it seeps into every interaction, unnoticed at first, until the inevitability becomes undeniable. I had spent months quietly cataloging behavior, reviewing budgets, and understanding how every allocation of funds influenced operations. Every misstep the board had made, every overlooked procedure, every assumption of my harmlessness was now leverage I wielded silently but with precision. An email arrived just then from the finance director, a person who had prided themselves on control. The subject line read, "Clarification needed on recent allocations." I opened it calmly, noting the careful, almost anxious wording. They were beginning to realize that I had been watching, reviewing, and quietly managing the foundation's lifeblood. I drafted my response carefully, each word precise, leaving no room for misinterpretation, no opportunity to challenge the authority I now quietly held. The first overt acknowledgement of my influence came in the form of a hesitant request during the midday meeting. Jeremy, a board member who had once dismissed my opinions as trivial, approached cautiously. "Mara, would you review the expenditure adjustments before we finalize them?" His tone was polite but tight with apprehension. I looked up slowly, meeting his eyes with a calm authority I had cultivated over years. "Of course, Jeremy. I'll review the adjustments and provide notes before the next board session." That simple exchange carried far more weight than he realized. Authority does not always roar, it whispers unseen, until it cannot be ignored. As the day progressed, I could sense the subtle recalibration taking place among the board members. Discussions that had previously been dominated by overconfidence and arrogance were now tentative, measured, cautious. Their confidence wavered in the presence of the very volunteer they had underestimated. I observed the micro-expressions, slight hesitations, careful pauses, brief glances toward me as if checking for validation. Every movement reinforced the invisible hierarchy I had quietly established. By mid-afternoon, the ripple effect extended beyond the office. Donors and partner organizations began asking for clarification on allocations, and I had ensured that all inquiries were routed through me. Subtle, deliberate, unavoidable, every action reminded the board that control had shifted. They were dependent on my oversight, my reviews, my approval. The Foundation's funding, which sustained 80% of their operations, was now a reflection of my meticulous management. The soft-hearted volunteer they had ignored was now an undeniable authority. Marcy approached me hesitantly, her voice quiet, almost trembling. "Mara, some of the flagged transactions, should we discuss them now?" I gestured calmly toward the conference table. "Yes. Let's review them together." As we went through each line item, I maintained a composed demeanor, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. There was no need for dramatic confrontation. The evidence, my oversight, and my quiet control spoke louder than any raised voice could. The board, when briefed later in the afternoon, reacted as expected: initial confusion, followed by tentative questions, and then dawning comprehension. The subtle panic began to creep in. Faces hardened, voices quieted, and gestures became cautious. They realized, in increments, that the soft-hearted volunteer they had dismissed held the authority to question, control, and redirect operations. The power I wielded was invisible but absolute. By evening, the office felt different. There was a restrained energy, an undercurrent of acknowledgement that shifted every interaction. Board members who had previously flaunted their authority now sought guidance, carefully phrased questions, and validation of decisions they had once assumed belonged solely to them. I observed quietly, savoring the inevitable recognition without speaking unnecessarily. Mara, the overlooked, underestimated quiet volunteer, had become the unseen lever controlling the organization's lifeblood. As I reviewed the day's emails, the corrected budgets, and the board responses, I reflected on the years that had led to this moment. Every slight, every dismissive remark, every assumption of my harmlessness had been quietly catalogued, transformed into a strategy of patient inevitability. Today, that strategy was manifest. Authority had shifted silently, irrevocably, and the subtle panic in the faces around me confirmed it. Stepping outside into the cool evening air, I allowed myself a rare private smile. The soft-hearted volunteer, ignored and underestimated for so long, now controlled the flow of funds, the oversight of decisions, and the accountability of those who had assumed dominance. The quiet, meticulous patience had worked perfectly. They would soon realize that no one, not arrogance, not confidence, not loud authority, could override the inevitability of quiet, calculated power. I whispered softly to myself, a private affirmation of the day's progress. They ignored me. They assumed I was harmless. They never imagined that the soft-hearted volunteer could control everything. And now, every decision, every dollar, every choice flows quietly, inevitably through me. The office smelled faintly of coffee and paper, a comfort in the chaos that had begun to settle around the board. I moved between desks, calm, deliberate, a quiet observer of the subtle storm I had orchestrated. Mara, the soft-hearted volunteer, was now the invisible force guiding the nonprofit's operations. And the first real tremors of recognition were beginning to ripple through the board. By mid-morning, the first visible signs of discomfort appeared. Carla, who had previously dismissed my emails with a wave of her hand, paused before opening her inbox. She hovered, fingers uncertain, her eyes flicking toward me. The flagged transactions I had silently audited sat there, untouched but impossible to ignore. She had always assumed my gentle nature equaled passivity. She was beginning to realize that what she thought was harmless softness was, in reality, meticulous oversight, complete control, and quiet authority. I let a faint, almost imperceptible smile play across my lips. Power, I had learned, does not always arrive in thunderous declarations. It creeps quietly into every interaction, every decision, every overlooked corner until its inevitability is undeniable. And today, that inevitability was beginning to take shape. An email pinged softly in my inbox, drawing my attention. It was from the finance director, someone who had once prided themselves on independence and control. The tone was careful, cautious, almost hesitant. "Mara, can we review the flagged budget items before presenting them to the board?" I drafted a precise, calm response. "Yes. I'll provide a full review by end of day." Please ensure all relevant documents are ready for discussion. The weight of my authority was quiet but absolute. Every carefully chosen word reinforced the fact that the soft-hearted volunteer they ignored now controlled the oversight they relied upon. The mid-afternoon board meeting confirmed the shift more clearly. As the flagged items were presented, I maintained my calm, measured demeanor. Each misallocated donation, each inflated expense, each minor misuse of funds I had quietly noted was laid out systematically. I did not raise my voice, I did not dramatize. I simply presented the facts, the meticulous records, the undeniable evidence of mismanagement. The silence that followed was telling. Eyes widened, postures stiffened, and subtle murmurs filled the room. The board had begun to comprehend that Mara, whom they had considered gentle, inexperienced, and soft-hearted, now wielded the ultimate influence over their operations. Every question they had previously shrugged off or ignored now required careful consideration. Every decision they had assumed belonged solely to them now passed under my quiet, watchful scrutiny. By late afternoon, the ripple effect extended beyond the office. Donors and partner organizations began sending inquiries, all routed through me. Subtle, strategic, unavoidable. Each interaction reinforced the board's realization that their reliance on the foundation's funding, and their need to account for every misstep, was now mediated entirely through my oversight. The soft-hearted volunteer they had ignored had become the invisible lever controlling the lifeblood of their operations. Mossy approached cautiously, her voice hesitant. Mara, do you think the board understands the implications? I looked up calmly, meeting her eyes. They will. Slowly, inevitably. Every observation, every report, every clarification I provide leaves them no choice but to acknowledge oversight, accountability, and authority. She nodded, apprehensive yet aware, understanding that patience and precision had quietly overturned the hierarchy she once assumed she controlled. By evening, the office had settled into a tense rhythm. Board members moved with caution, staff approached me first for guidance, and even minor procedural questions were routed through me. I reviewed emails, reports, and flagged items again, noting the subtle nervous deference in every response. The quiet control I had cultivated was now unmistakable, a force as invisible as it was absolute. Stepping onto the balcony, I let the cool evening air brush against my face, savoring the calm triumph of quiet authority. Mara, the volunteer overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed, had achieved what overt ambition could not: complete, unquestioned control over the organization's operations. They had assumed my gentleness equaled weakness. They had assumed I could be ignored. And now, as the subtle panic, hesitation, and deference spread through the board, they were realizing that quiet patience and meticulous oversight wielded a power they could not resist. I whispered to myself softly, almost as a secret, they ignored me, they dismissed me, they assumed my heart made me harmless. And now, every dollar, every decision, every action bends quietly, inevitably, through me. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting sharp patterns across my office floor. The air felt different today, charged, deliberate, expectant. I knew the board was unsettled. They had begun to understand, at least subconsciously, that the soft-hearted volunteer they dismissed was the one quietly holding the organization's lifeblood in her hands. Every misallocated fund, every overlooked expense, every subtle mismanagement they assumed was harmless was now fully visible under my meticulous review. By mid-morning, the subtle tremors of realization had become more obvious. Emails came in cautiously, questions phrased with careful diplomacy, requests for clarification tinged with unease. Even the most confident board members hesitated before sending messages, reviewing drafts multiple times before hitting send. I responded carefully, my words precise and calm, carrying the weight of authority without a hint of arrogance. The soft-hearted Mara was no longer invisible. I was an undeniable presence guiding every decision, every allocation, every motion. Carla approached during a budget review, her hands trembling slightly as she presented a set of reports she had prepared without fully checking them. Her tone was hesitant, unsure. Mara, I wanted to make sure these figures are accurate before the board meeting. I leaned back, meeting her gaze evenly calmly, and said, thank you for preparing these. I've reviewed them, and there are some areas that need adjustments. Let's correct them before the session. Her eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. The subtle acknowledgement of authority passed without confrontation. By noon, the tension in the boardroom was palpable. Members shuffled papers, whispered to one another, cast nervous glances my way. They had once assumed they controlled the flow of funding, that the soft-hearted volunteer was nothing more than a background presence. They had assumed wrong. I outlined the flagged transactions with quiet precision, showing patterns of minor misuse, misallocated donations, and negligent record-keeping. I did not accuse, I did not shout, I simply presented the facts. The silence that followed was heavy. Eyes darted, fingers twitched, and the board members shifted uneasily in their seats. It was subtle but unmistakable, the realization had sunk in. The volunteer they had dismissed controlled the very funds that sustained their operations. Every question they had previously ignored now demanded careful attention. Every decision they had assumed was theirs to make now passed through my oversight. The soft-hearted Mara had become the invisible architect of accountability. Late afternoon brought a subtle escalation. Donor inquiries, routed through me, raised pointed questions about budget allocations, asking for clarifications the board had not anticipated. I had anticipated them months ago, preparing detailed responses, verifying each allocation, and ensuring the board's oversight, or lack thereof, was now fully apparent. The subtle panic among the board members was growing. They realized that they were accountable not only to the donors, but to the volunteer they had ignored for so long. Marcy approached quietly, her voice low. "Mara, they're asking for explanations that weren't even in the reports. They're nervous." I nodded slowly. Good. Nervous is appropriate. They're beginning to understand that every misstep, every oversight, every ignored email has consequences. And those consequences are now fully visible. She nodded, almost reverently, understanding the quiet inevitability of the shift in authority. By evening, the office felt charged with a restrained energy. Board members walked carefully, staff approached me first for guidance, and even minor decisions were routed through my oversight. The soft-hearted volunteer they had dismissed had become the invisible force shaping every aspect of the organization. Every subtle glance, every hesitant movement, every carefully phrased question reinforced the authority I exercised. I paused at the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the office. I allowed myself a private smile. The triumph was not loud, not dramatic, not fueled by confrontation. It was quiet, deliberate, and inevitable. Authority had arrived silently, patient and precise, and the board's panic, hesitation, and acknowledgement were proof of its full effect. Mara, the overlooked, underestimated, gentle volunteer, had achieved undeniable influence over the operations she had once been dismissed in. As the office emptied, I reviewed the day's emails, verified corrected allocations, and noted the subtle nervous acknowledgement in every message. My patience had paid off. Years of careful observation, quiet diligence, and meticulous review had built an authority that could not be ignored. The board would soon fully understand that every decision, every allocation, every choice flowed through my oversight, and resistance was no longer an option. I stepped outside into the cool night air, inhaling deeply. Mara, the soft-hearted, gentle, underestimated volunteer, had quietly orchestrated a transformation that could not be reversed. The subtle recalibration of authority was complete. Every dollar, every report, every decision now passed through the hands of the one they had assumed was harmless. The quiet power was absolute, and it was beautifully inevitable. I whispered softly, privately, almost reverently, "They ignored me, dismissed me, thought my gentleness made me weak. And now, everything bends quietly, inevitably, through me." The office was quiet, almost eerily so, as I stepped through the corridors that had once felt like mere passageways of observation. Each step resonated with the subtle hum of authority I had cultivated over months, years, even quietly, invisibly. Mara, the soft-hearted volunteer dismissed for her gentle nature, had become the unseen pulse of the organization. The board members, once loud and overconfident, now moved with cautious respect, their assumptions dismantled piece by the quiet inevitability of my oversight. By mid-morning, the first board meeting since the last round of revealed discrepancies had begun. The air was thick with unease, a tension almost tactile. Carla, who had been so quick to dismiss me in the past, avoided eye contact for the first few minutes, her hands clutching the folder she had prepared with meticulous care. Her confidence, once brash and loud, had been tempered by the realization that I controlled the flow of funding, the oversight of every allocation, and the accountability she and the others had assumed lay solely with them. I did not speak immediately. I let them sit with the discomfort, letting the weight of my presence settle across the room. Authority does not always demand sound. Sometimes, it exists in the subtle recalibration of the environment, the silent acknowledgement that someone else quietly holds the power. I had spent years cataloging, observing, and strategizing, and now every careful decision, every misstep they had made, every dismissed email they assumed would be ignored, all converged in this moment of inevitable recognition. The meeting began in a measured cadence. I spoke calmly, deliberately, outlining each misallocation, each improper adjustment, each subtle misuse of the Foundation's resources. I did not need to emphasize blame. The facts, carefully presented, spoke volumes. They could no longer hide behind ignorance or arrogance. Each carefully documented transaction reinforced the quiet but absolute authority I wielded. The board's nervous glances toward me, the slight tremor in their gestures, even the careful phrasing of their questions, every small reaction confirmed what I had known all along. Mara had become indispensable, unavoidable, inevitable. By late morning, the board members were navigating the conversation with care, their previous bravado replaced by cautious calculation. Even Jeremy, who had once assumed my silence equaled incompetence, asked for clarification on several reports before making decisions. The subtle acknowledgement of authority, almost unconscious, spread through the room like an invisible tide. The soft-hearted volunteer, once invisible and underestimated, now guided the direction, accountability, and resource allocation of the organization she had once served quietly. The first donor inquiries arrived mid-afternoon, routed as always through me. They sought clarification, explanations, accountability. I had anticipated each question, prepped each response with meticulous care, and ensured the board was subtly aware of every inquiry. Every acknowledgement of my oversight, every cautious response, every nervous recalibration reinforced the reality. Mara, the gentle, quiet, overlooked volunteer, was now the architect of accountability. As the day progressed, subtle changes were evident in every interaction. Board members paused to consider my recommendations, staff deferred to my guidance on procedural matters, and even the smallest decisions passed under my meticulous review. The quiet shift in power had been complete. Those who had once mocked, ignored, or dismissed me were now navigating the organization's lifeblood through the hands of the volunteer they had underestimated. The quiet, soft-hearted Mara had become the unstoppable, invisible force guiding every motion. As evening fell, I stood on the balcony overlooking the city, the lights reflecting off the buildings like distant stars. I allowed myself a rare private smile. The triumph was not loud, not dramatic, not fueled by confrontation. It was quiet, deliberate, patient, and inevitable. Every slight, every dismissed email, every assumption of harmlessness had been transformed into leverage. Every decision, every allocation, every choice now flowed through my hands, and the organization was operating under the authority of the soft-hearted volunteer they had once ignored. I whispered softly to myself, almost reverently, they ignored me, dismissed me, thought my gentleness made me powerless. And now, everything bends quietly, inevitably, through me. The city hummed below, unaware of the subtle, unstoppable victory that had quietly reshaped the nonprofit. The soft-hearted volunteer had become the undeniable authority, the silent pulse that guided every choice, every dollar, every action. In that moment, I realized the true power of quiet patience, meticulous oversight, and invisible authority. Mara had not sought confrontation. Mara had not sought to punish. Mara had only observed, learned, and acted with precision. And the result was perfect. The ones who underestimated her were now fully accountable, fully aware, and fully dependent on her unwavering, quiet control. The triumph was silent but absolute. The soft-hearted volunteer they had overlooked had become the architect of accountability, the keeper of resources, the quiet force that ensured integrity and oversight. Every glance, every question, every decision now reflected the inevitability of her presence. Mara had finally, quietly won.